Hello. Today I want to introduce a notation system I've invented for the Harpejji. The Harpejji is this instrument right here. Don't worry if you don't know anything about the instrument. I'll walk you through the basics in this first section of the video. If you're a music nerd or you like patterns or you like solving puzzles, you'll definitely like this video. It's building a system and, problem solving and structure and stuff. So I know a lot of people get off on that kind of thing. So if that sounds like something you'd like, stay tuned because it gets pretty dense. But by the end of it, you'll understand how the system works. And I've picked all these examples to build off each other to propel you to that point where you understand everything. And to prove that the system works, I've done a full transcription of Jacob Collier's arrangement of White Christmas for solo Harpejji. And I'll run through that at the end of the video. And that was really a limit test to prove that my system works and that, it's logically coherent and it can be applied to any music written for the instrument. So this solves a major issue in the Harpejji community because as, before now, has not been a way to actually share ideas on the instrument. There's no notated music for the Harpejji, and this solves that and lets people share ideas, and that will let us build a real pedagogy for the instrument and just build what's possible on the instrument in the future. So I really want community feedback from the established Harpejji players. If you do actually play Harpejji, please watch this video and please learn how to use this system and give me your feedback. If you have any questions, just reach out to me on my website. I'm going to have a blog post up and downloads for the Jacob Collier arrangement. Super easy to get to. Just go to the link in the description and I'll hook you up with all that. So if you prefer reading, you can, watch this video and go look at the blog post as a refresher later on when you're trying to run through the system and learn. But anyways, yeah, I just want community feedback. I want to revise this with what people, think and get some buy-in from the community so that we can really propel this instrument forward, going into the future and really open it up to more people to play. But anyways, let's get into it. So thank you so much. Okay, let's do a brief introduction of the Harpejji just to get everyone on the same page. So the Harpejji is a multi-stringed amplified instrument. It's got the layout resembling a piano with the harp more of a guitar, and it is a musical grid. So the strings go up in whole tones, they're all the same, and then the frets are chromatic, going up, so half steps. So whole steps, half steps. Now, if you want to play a scale, we're going to start on C, and the C's are the boxes with the line in them. So a way to play a scale would look like this, which is a major scale. But you can also play it like this, and there's a bunch of other ways. And that's a big reason that we need a notation system, because there's so many different ways to write fingerings for the same harmonic or melodic idea. So we need a way to share the ideas. Let's build up the fundamental logic behind the Harpejji notation system. We'll start from scratch. So on top of regular music notation, what is the fundamental thing we need to relay to the player so that they can figure out how to play anything on this instrument? That's going to be the position on the fretboard. Since there's so many repeated notes, which one do you want the person to play? Like, where are you playing? How do you tell someone that? So the purely logical way to go about it, it's a big grid, right? So XY coordinate plane, X, Y, your strings are your X, 1 through 16 strings, and then your Y will be 1 through 19 frets. And if you want to pick any note here, you can give it a coordinate. So we'll start with this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. This would be 6, 3. And now you can give a coordinate point for anywhere on the grid. So that doesn't work very well for humans. If you're having a robot play the instrument, you could do something like that, but it doesn't really work for people. But this is the fundamental logic behind the Harpejji notation system. We just need to adjust how we're referring to our X and Y coordinates, and that'll morph into a more symbolic representation of the instrument that is manageable to understand by people and is actually useful. So we'll start with our y-axis. We don't actually need to give the fret numbers. The information we need is inherent to the instrument. So on any one string, you can only play a note in one spot. So if I'm on this string and I want to play a low C, it will always be here. And an octave up will always be here. So we can rely on regular music notation to provide the notes. That means that we've eliminated our y-axis, and now we only need to specify which string we're on. Now, 16 strings is still too many to have just a standard, string 10, string 10, string 11, string 9. That's just not very easy to read quickly. So a large part of this system is how we're defining which string to play and moving between them. And spoiler, it's a referential system, so we'll get into that now. So let's talk about how the referential system works. At the beginning of a section of music, you need to define your starting string for the player, and then from there, you're going to use sets of arrows to tell them where they need to go string-wise. So if they need to go up a string, you use just an up arrow. Down a string, just the down arrow. Now, if they need to go up 2 strings, that's skipping a string, so it's an arrow with a dot. The dot means the skip. So 2 dots, 2 skips, 3 dots, 3 skips. After that, you start to use numbers, so 4, 5, 6. Past that, you don't really use that. You're going to reestablish that string some other way, which we'll get into later on. So we call these string position modifiers. And that's how you determine which string to play. And this will sink in more as we get into the examples. So I want to circle back around to how we are naming the strings, because I said, 1 through 16, but that's hard to read. It was like the issue with the frets earlier. So what is an easier way to name these? It's inherent to the instrument, because if we had them 1 through 16, you need to label them. Which isn't very cool. So instead of 1 through 16, we're going to use the lowest fret note values for the naming scheme. So C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, back to C. We're going to change these. We're going to get rid of the sharps just to reduce clutter, and they're unnecessary for this purpose. So it becomes C, D, E, F, G, A. Now it goes C1, D1, E1, F1, G1, A1, and C2, D2, E2, F2. So that's how we name it. And that way, if someone says, C1, it's right here, where that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, string 7. So it's easier to find C1 than string 7, which is why we're changing that. So I think it's time to actually get into some of the examples. I've been yapping long enough now. So we're going to start with Mary Had a Little Lamb. Classic. All right, finally some actual music. Let's get into it. So we're going to start looking just at the right hand. Our starting string is A1, like we just talked about. A1 is right here. And we need the E above middle C to start. So that's right here. Middle C runs like this. These are all middle C's on the Harpejji. So string A1, E above middle C, and we need our 4th finger. So this is what we need to play. Now we need to go down to D with our 3rd finger, and it's down a string. That's right here. Now from there, we go down a string again with our 2nd finger on C. That is right there. Now we're going back up, so up a string, 3rd finger on D, then up another string, 4th finger on E. Now, when there's no string position modifier and no fingering change, that means play the same note with the same finger on the same string. So now we're into the 3rd measure. We go down a string again with our 3rd finger. Now up a string again with our 4th finger to E. Now we get our first skip. Exciting. So we're going to the G with our 5th finger. So not on this string, on the next one up. Where is G? It's right here. Now we go back down, skip down with our 4th finger to E, down a string to D, down to C, back up, repeat. You should hopefully get the idea. Now let's look at the left hand. So our starting string is G, C, D, E, F, G. So we need the C below middle C on the G string, which is this one right here. And we need it with our 2nd finger. So now we go down. We skip 2 strings. Whoa. So down 2 strings with our 4th finger. So not this one, but this string. And we need to play a G. That is right here. And then we skip 2 strings back up to that same C with the same finger. So it's just right there. And then the same thing we just did, back up. So pretty straightforward. Let's play it together now. So hopefully you're starting to get the idea of how the system works. Hopefully it makes a bit more sense and it's not just a bunch of jumbled symbols. So let's move on to a more complex melodic idea. This next example is a melodic excerpt from Frank Zappa's Inca Roads. And it really shows a lot of strengths of this system, especially when you're trying to figure out complex fingerings. Something like this would be really useful for transcribing jazz licks and being able to come back to them and figure out what you were doing, later down the line. So anyways, let's get into this. I'll play it slowly for you first, and then I will break it down. So, if we look at the music, we're starting on string F1. That's right here. And we need to play a C with our 3rd finger. That's a middle C because of the 8BA. So we start here. We go up a string with our 4th finger on D. Now back down to that same string, 2nd finger on B. Then up to C. Now we go down to A. Like this, and if you see that slur means it's a pull off. That's just like guitar notation. We can talk about that later. So C down to A. Now going on, we're skipping a string over to G with our 2nd finger. Now back up to 4th finger on C. Now we're going down to E, skipping a string with our thumb, up to 4 on A. Going a string up. Now we go down 3 strings, skipping to our 2nd finger on C, down to A with our thumb, another pull off. Now same string, skip one over to F. E. Now pull off, same string, thumb on D. Now F sharp with our 2nd finger up the string. Now we skip 5 strings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to pinky on another F sharp. Now skip a string down, then back down to that F sharp with our 2nd finger, pull off to 1 on E. Then over skipping to D, down another string, and another pull off to end. So let's go back and look at that 5-string jump, because 5 strings, that's a lot to jump. That seems like it would be pretty difficult, but we have to look at the interval. So it's an octave. So whenever there's a 5-string jump and it's an octave, it's going to be on that same fret level, but an octave higher. So it will always look like that when it's an octave. And that's how the symbolic representation of the fretboard works in this system. Any combination of interval and string position modifier will create the same shape anywhere. So if you ever see a whole step up that's just 1 string up, it will always look like this. If it's a minor third with 1 string up, it'll always look like this. If it's a major or perfect fourth and you're skipping a string, it'll always look like this. Fifth, the shapes always look the same with the same interval and the same jumps in strings, the same string position change. So that's why you can create a symbolic representation of the fretboard with this system, because as you go along and as you get better using this system, you'll notice these patterns more, and you won't have to be thinking as hard, because you'll just know what the shapes are going to be because of the interval and the string position modifier. Okay, before we move on to chords, I want to point out 2 really versatile aspects of this system and introduce the concept of reference strings. So looking back at the Zappa example, it has us starting on F1, but let's say we wanted to start somewhere else. Let's say we want to just start on E1 instead. So all of the string position modifiers still work if we change the starting string to wherever we want. You're only constrained by the actual physical size of the fretboard. So it still works here. This is the same as written. Well, you get the idea. And the second part is if we transcribe this into a different key. So if we just take this and we move it down 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones, and our first starting note is an A flat. Let's say we start it here. You can follow the same string position modifiers. So this notation system keeps the isomorphic nature of the instrument, because you can transpose music and keep the same patterns in the strings with the relative system for determining string position. All right, let's introduce the concept of a reference string. It'll be important when we get to chords in a second. So a reference string is the string that a string position modifier is referring to. So in our example, the Zappa one, we're starting on string F1 here, and our next note has a string position modifier that is an arrow up, and it's a D. So this. So that string position modifier is looking back at the previous segment of music, which was the previous note, and it's referring back to the string that was set here, the F1. Now, that's pretty obvious when you're working solely with melodies, but when you're playing something like this, if you had an arrow going up, if the next note after this chord was like 1 note here, how do you know what to play? Because there's a bunch of different strings being played at once. So you need to introduce the concept of a dominant reference string when you have multiple strings being played at once in one hand. And we have ways to do that I'll get into in the chords, but I just wanted to outline the concept of a reference string before we got to that. Let's get into chords. So we're going to apply the same logic that we've established in the melodic examples to notating chords now. So this is going to be broken into 2 different methods. We're going to have slash notation and no slash notation. So these are equivalent, as in you can write any music with either of these 2 methods, but sometimes one of them is going to be way easier to read than the other. So the one that you pick is going to be based on the context of the music. So we'll start with slash notation. Now, as you can see, there's a new symbol, and that's the slash here. So the slash represents the dominant reference string of the chord. So it's going to be the string that everything else is built off of. And that answers the question that I posed just before this about how we are going to determine which string to look at when we're playing the next notes going forward. So we'll get into it. We're starting on the A string here, and we're playing a C. Now, the slash note, if you're at the beginning and you need to use a string label, which is what that A is, if you have a string label, the slash note is played on that string. So our thumb is going to be on the C on the A string. So it's right here. Let me play it for you first. So pretty easy. On piano, or if you're new to Harpejji, it's the same as doing this. It's just a cooler fingering. So, breaking it down, A string, thumb here. Now, the E has a string position modifier that's up one string with our second finger, so that goes here. Now, up another string, third finger on G, and we skip a string, fourth finger on B. Now, the next chord, the slashed note is a D, and if you notice, there's no change in the string there. So it's the same string, and it's going to be on 2. And the next note is up a string, and then we skip a string, and we skip another string. Now notice that the string position modifiers are referencing the previous string. So the string position modifiers reference the strings moving outwards from the slash note, because in this example, the slash notes are on the bottom, but they can be anywhere in the chord, and that will change contextually based off what you're trying to notate. Sometimes it makes more sense to have it at the top, and sometimes at the bottom, sometimes in the middle. So anyways, the second chord is this. Now we are moving our slash note, our dominant reference string. That is going up one string because of the string position modifier that is coming before the slash. So that's how you move it. So now our second finger is going to be on E, then up a string to G, skip a string to C, and skip another string to D. So there's that. Then the next chord, we're also moving the dominant reference string up one, and this time it's going to be our thumb on F, up a string. So that's right here. Now we are going up a string, up another string, and skipping a string. And then going backwards down, it's going to be the same thing, but now you can see our dominant reference string is moving in the opposite direction. So we're here, first chord of the second measure. Now we move down a string here with our second finger on E. Now we're up a string, skipping a string, skipping a string. We just played this. And now we go down another reference string, another string, then up, skip, skip, and we're on that same string with our thumb on C, then up a string, up another string, and skipping the last one. So with this method, you can start to see patterns emerging. So if you notice, the first and fourth chords have the same shape. And that's because they are both major 7 block chords, and they both have the same setup of string position modifiers. So like we talked about before, if it has the same string position modifier combined with the same interval will create the same pattern on the fretboard. So that applies to chords too. So that's how you know these are going to be the same shape. And same with the D minor, E minor. So these are both block minor 7 chords, and they have the same string position modifier layout. So that's how you know the shapes are going to be the same. And as you get better with this system, you'll recognize chord shapes just off the bat. So that is slash notation, and now we'll get into non-slash notation. Let's get into the second method we have for notating chords in the Harpejji notation system. This is called non-slashed notation, otherwise known as voiced notation. And the whole concept here is that each note in the chord is getting its own set of string position modifiers and reference strings. So we're not bound to one dominant string that is used to reference all the strings played in the chord like we are with slash notation. So let's get into it, and then we can talk about pros and cons of using one method over the other afterwards. So to start, the first chord in this example is actually written in slashed notation, but I'll play the whole thing for you first. So let's get into it. We're starting with the string label D1, and we're playing a G with our second finger. Then we're skipping a string up to C with our third finger and skipping another string up to E with our fourth finger. Now if we look, the fingering is similar, so we're using 2, 3, 4 for the rest of this example here. So you don't have to worry about fingering. Now this was given to us in slash notation. Now we're moving into voiced notation. So each note in the chord is getting its own set of string position modifiers and reference strings. So we'll start from the bottom and work up. The G is moving up to an A, up a string. You can see the string position modifier there. The C is staying the same. It's not moving. And the E is sliding up to F. There's no string position modifier, so it's on the same string. So that is the second chord. Now we move back, going from the bottom again. That A moves down to the G. The C stays the same still, and that F slides back down. Moving on, all of the voices in this chord are moving down a string. So this G is now going to the F. The C is now going over a string down to the A, and the E is moving down to a D. Then last chord, we are moving that F down to an E on the same string, no string position modifier, and the A is moving down a string to the G, and we're moving down to C, a string over here. Now we're going to take that same example and we're going to put some melodic content before and after it so that we can see how we move into voiced notation in some actual, musical context. So I'll just play this example and then show you how we get in and out of it. So we are starting on D2 with our fifth finger, this string here, fifth finger, and we're doing a little major triad down, C major. And now we're getting into what we just went over. So now the first chord isn't written in slashed notation. It's going straight into voiced notation. So the way this works is that every note in that first chord is referencing the string position of the last part of the harmonic content. So that's the C. So we go, now when we're at the C, this is the reference string for this whole chord, the first chord of the second measure. So going from the bottom, that G is referencing the C here. So we're skipping a string down and playing it with our second finger. The C here, there's no string position modifier, so it's the same as before. And now this this E here is skipping a string up. So that's how we get to this chord moving from a single line in voiced notation. And now this is the same as we did before. Now, to get out of voiced notation, we need to reestablish a reference string because we're playing 3 strings. So how do we know which one to pick when we come out of it? That is the point of the slash you can see there. So that slash means that that note, the string that is being played for that note, becomes the new reference string for the next piece of music or melodic content, whatever. So that is the E. It has a slash on it. So this is now the reference string for the rest of this measure, the D. So you can see there's no string position modifier. So we're going to play on the same string. And that slur means that it's a pull off. So we're going to play a D on the same string, pulling off from the E. Now we're skipping over a string, third finger on C to A, down a string, another pull off to 1 on the G, and then back up to C with your third finger. So. So that's how you get in and out of voiced notation. So let's move on to the pros and cons of using voiced notation versus slash notation. Now that we've covered both methods for notating chords on Harpejji, how do you decide which one to use? So you can loosely think about it like you'd think about harmony. You can think about harmony vertically and horizontally. Now vertically is kind of related to slash notation, and horizontally is like voiced notation. So if you're thinking about harmony vertically, you're thinking how the notes in the chord work together in that one chord. So like jazz voicings on piano, upper extensions, that kind of thing. And if you're thinking about harmony horizontally, you're thinking about voices like singing, you know. So choral music, SATB arrangements, that kind of thing. The voices are moving independently and they're their own thing, you know. So that's kind of how you can pick which one to use in a nutshell. So I would say that slash notation is more versatile. If you have complex fingerings or some kind of hard stuff, it usually is easier to read if it's in slashed notation. But voiced notation has its own benefits. If you're mostly using the same fingers for something like that example I showed, voiced notation is a lot easier to read and it's less cluttered. Also, an advantage of voiced notation is that it's easier to read the individual voices in the chord as you go along. So if you need to pick out, you know, an alto part from a set of chords, it's easier to do that in voiced notation because it has its own set of string modifiers and reference strings. You don't have to build up to it from one dominant string position like you do in slashed notation. But overall, you have to look at the context of the music to figure out which is going to be easier to read. But usually it's pretty straightforward which one you should pick. And when in doubt, just write it out in both ways and then pick the one that's easier to read. So if you're still with me here, thank you so much for watching. I have one last concept, and then we can get into some more fun stuff. I know this is pretty dense, but you have a great attention span if you're still watching this, so thank you. Okay, I want to talk about the third and final usage of slashes in this notation system. So far, we've seen slashes used in slashed chord notation to denote the dominant reference string, and we've seen them used to get out of voiced notation by reestablishing a reference string. So the final use is pretty similar to the voiced notation usage, where we are establishing a reference string. This time we're using the slash to look back at something we've previously played and to pull that reference string back, basically. So I have this little simple bass line to show what I mean by that. I'll play it for you and then we'll break it down. So we start by going up 6. And then instead of writing a string position modifier going down 6 strings to get back to where we just were, we can use a slash. And now that slash is looking back on the same line or space that it's put on, and it looks back to the most recent note that was in that position. So it's looking back to the first note in that measure in this instance. So that means you go back to the string that you were playing that one note on. So that's how you know to go back here. And then that sets the reference string back to that previously played string also. So moving forward, the next string position modifier going up to the E flat is referencing this string because of that slash. And then you can see we use that a couple more times to reestablish reference strings to things that were previously played. So you need to be careful when you're using this, and you need to make sure that it contextually makes sense in the music, because sometimes these slashes really make sense and they make things a lot easier to understand, and other times they can just get confusing. So you need to make sure you're using them in a way that makes sense. But it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. But that's the last usage of slashes. And it can really save you some clutter in string position modifiers and make things easier to understand. I'll run through a more advanced use of these slashes in the Jacob Collier transcription. I'm going to do a quick rundown of a bunch of different playing techniques and how to notate them on the Harpejji. So this area is probably the least fleshed out in the system right now. So there's a lot of room for improvement and community feedback and input. So I'm going to run through the most fleshed out ideas to the least fleshed out ideas. We'll start with gliss lines. So if you play a gliss on Harpejji, you're going to be using the same string with the same finger. So, that's a gliss. So that kind of thing. So if you're playing a gliss, you are not changing your finger or the string position, and a gliss does not change the reference string in the notation system. And we'll look at some examples of glisses in the Jacob Collier transcription. So next up we have hammer-ons and pull-offs. We talked about that a little bit in the Zappa example, but you have a slur between the two notes that you're either playing a hammer-on or a pull-off, and it needs to be on the same string, so there shouldn't be any string position modifier changes between those two notes. And it'll look as a hammer-on, and then pull-offs like that. So pretty straightforward. You can do a lot of different stuff with that. Next up we have staccatos. So if you have the dot, staccato, you can play that kind of thing instead of, so it's good for funk and stuff like that. Bends, we're just going to use lines like you would on guitar notation, but remember you can only bend up a half step. But we're getting more into the stuff that's less fleshed out here now. Strumming, probably just going to use an arrow like guitar notation, unless someone has a better idea. I don't know. And then harmonics, I have no clue how to do that yet, but there's definitely easy ways to do it, but I haven't had time to look into it yet, and this has already been a big effort, so we'll get to that at some point. Same with like single finger strumming, so like this kind of thing. I'm not exactly sure how to notate that yet, but not a huge deal. Anyways, finally we're going to get into the Jacob Collier transcription. So this was a ton of work, but I did it as a limit test to prove that this system works on any music you can throw at it. And I thought this Jacob Collier arrangement of White Christmas would be a great example to use, because Jacob Collier is a genius, and the original video he posted has a perfect view of his hands. So if you really want to dive into this transcription and get a better feel for how the system works on actual music, please go watch his original video and read through the music. If you want it to make any sense, though, put it on like halftime speed, like 50% speed, because it's incomprehensible at regular time. I had it on 50% the whole time I was transcribing it. But anyways, I'm going to split this into 2 parts. I'm going to play through a couple of measures of this. I'm not going to do the whole thing because that would just be painful for everyone involved. And then I'm going to talk through some of the aspects of how the system works in actual music and putting together the framework I've laid out so far. All right, I'm going to run through the first 2 measures of this. I apologize in advance for my playing. I spent all my time writing the transcription and coming up with the system, so haven't really spent any time trying to learn this. That's kind of proof that the system works. So I'll play it and then try and break it down for you after. Okay, so we are starting on string C2, 3rd finger, and on the G string with our 4th finger. And start here. First note is in the left hand, skipping 3 strings up to B flat. Then we're skipping a string down to the E flat 2nd finger. So now our 3rd finger comes over here. And now we're going into voice notation in the right hand. So the reference string is here now, and we skip up a string and we go to that B flat. And then here we go up a string to the C. Now we're doing a gliss down in the top voice, going down a string to our 3rd finger in our left hand. Now we're doing a gliss down in our right hand and a pull off in our left. Then a hammer on in the left and a gliss back up, and then up a string in our left hand and glissing up the top voice and leaving the other voice in the right hand the same. So now we're here, and then we're using that slash to set the reference string in our left hand back here, and then we go up a string to the F natural. And then in that left hand, we move the reference string back to the C with that next slash. Then we go down the 3rd finger to the B flat, and we have a 5-lit between there, like that. So in our right hand, those notes are the same as we just played, so it's the same fingers in the same spot. So now we have this really cool gliss. Whoops. Made it super far without messing that up. But anyway, so we're here like that. And that's what the glisses show there. Then after that, we are in our left hand going to set the reference string to that G, and then it's skipping a string down to a E flat with our pinky, and up to that D flat. Sorry, E flat. My bad. Which we just played, so we don't need to designate anything for that. So that's just the first 2 measures. You can see why going through this whole thing would be kind of painful. I want to play one of my favorite sections from this piece and then break down this really cool pattern at the beginning. So this pattern at the beginning, we're starting 2nd finger on F1 and 2nd finger in the left hand on D, and it's kind of, the voices are spreading out. So start here, gliss down, and we go up 1 string, a whole step. Like that. Isn't that cool? Anyways, I'm not going to break down the rest of it. You get the idea at this point. I want to talk through some cool applications of the Harpejji notation system in this transcription. This will also be a refresher on the notation system's logic, and the point of this is to give you some ideas on how to apply the system to some real music. So I want to start by talking about string memory. So it's a pretty straightforward concept, but I just wanted to give it a formal name. So in instances like this, where you're playing the same note that you were playing before, if there's no string position modifiers and there's no fingering changes, it's safe to assume that you're playing these notes with the same finger on the same strings. If there is a fingering change, then change the finger and keep the same string. And then if there is a string position modifier that changes where you play them, then it's no longer string memory. So an important part of this is that these instances do not change the reference string. So that doesn't really matter right here in these notes, but there'll be an example a little later on in this transcription where it actually does matter that these string memory instances don't change the reference string. So let's get into the transcription a bit. Next thing I want to talk about are courtesy string labels. So here, of course, we have our regular starting string labels, and that's telling us where we place our hands so that we can use a referential system to work through everything. Now, when we get to here, we have string labels in parentheses, and these are courtesy string labels. So these don't have any effect on the actual music, meaning that if they weren't here, you could still play through the whole piece. You have enough information to get between sections with the reference strings. So all the information you need is there without these. But these help you stay on track to make sure that you didn't mess up somewhere, and it helps you when you're running through parts of the music, not from the very beginning. So, if you wanted to come through and run, this measure right here or something, well, you know where to start. Without these courtesy string labels, you'd have to work out what string you're on all the way from the beginning. So they're really important, but they don't actually affect anything in the music. They're just a courtesy so you know where you are, like courtesy accidentals. So let's get into the stuff I wanted to talk about in the actual transcription. In measure 3 here, we have a more advanced usage of slashes, of reference slashes. So here, let's look at just this hand. We have a little bass line, and there's kind of a second voice above the bass line. So to manage that in the system, we jump up, it's kind of normal here, and then to get back down to this note, instead of using a really big string position modifier jump down, we are using this reference slash. So this slash is vertically based, so it's looking back like this to the closest note. So in this instance, it's looking back here, and it sets the reference string to the string that was used to play this note. So now the reference string is set to here, and we play this note on the same string we played this one on. Going forward, to get to this note, we are using another reference slash to look back to this note, and then that sets a reference string to the same string used here. And then this string position modifier moves that string up 1. So the string that we're using to play here is the same string we used here, up 1. That's what this means here. And then again, similar down here, we're looking back to this note, and then we are a string skip up to play this note. And then similar here. So that is just a more advanced way to use slashes and how you can use reference slashes to manage multiple voices at once when it's not all together in something that would be more beneficial to use voice notation for. So moving on, in measure 4, we have our first usage of slashed chord notation in this transcription, and it's not really used very much in this. So looking here, our dominant reference string is denoted with this slash, and that is looking back at this string position modifier for this note. So we're basing this chord off of the string that's given to us here, because this is the reference string that this chord is referring to, the one given by the string position modifier for this note here. So that note here is played on the same string as these, and then this note is a string down, and then this is a skipped string down from here. And then moving out of that, we are using the slash here to move the string position modifier, or sorry, to move the reference string to the string played here, because that's what we're using going forward. So we can use the slashes as you would in voiced notation to get out. We can use them in other instances when it is beneficial to do so. So moving on to measure 6, I want to talk about this slash usage right here. So this is a reference slash, like I was just talking about. This is looking back and setting the reference string moving forward to here, to the note, to the string used to play this note. And it's nice to double up the slashes anytime there is a page break or a new page, line break or a new page. So this means the same thing as this. It's just a courtesy to put them in both places, so you know it's coming, and it's not like, oh wait, where, it's more obvious that it's coming here. And the reason that I did this, you have to look at the context of the music. So here we're doing this little walk down and then holding a bass note and filling out this chord with the other fingers. So it would be perfectly legal within the system to define the string used to play the note here with a string position modifier jump down from this note here. But it's easier to read if we are referencing this note, because it's the bass line. So it's the same voice as here that's being played. Your pinky is just moving down a string. So it's easier to think about, okay, look back at what your pinky did, now it's going down one. That's easier to understand than, okay, you filled out this chord, the bottom voice of this chord, now you need to jump down like 4 strings or whatever it is. So it's just contextually easier to read in this instance. But you could do it either way and they both work. So moving on from that, I want to show an example where there's multiple voices where I didn't use the slash notation like I showed there. So if we look here, there's kind of 2 voices going, but I did not bother to use any kind of slash notation. I'm using just one set of string position modifiers. And we're here and we jump back and we jump down. And in this case, it's easier to understand because there's not a huge gap in the voices, and using the slashes is just going to add a little bit more complexity, and you're only like, a string skip away in the voices. So in instances like this, I kind of decided to only use one set and use the string position modifiers to jump between, instead of using slashes to completely go between the voices. So it's contextual, and it's up to you and what you think is easier and what you think people will be able to read and understand. So moving on. So we are here now, and I want to talk about this left hand action here. So in this section, we're doing a little run up here, and then our left hand is completely coming off and going and playing this note here. And if you notice, there's 2 slurs, so it's a hammer-on and a pull-off there. And we're on the same string because there's no string position modifiers between the 2. And the left hand means that we bring the left hand over. It's not my favorite to write it like this, but it works. It gets the point across. It's fine for now. And after that, we come back down to the same spot. So 2 reference slashes looking back to get us back to the same position we were at when we bring our hand back around. Now moving on, there's a cool usage of slashes here in measure 10. So we build up to this chord with a bunch of glisses and stuff, so it's really cool. And then here we need to add some voices to the chord towards the end. So to do that, I put a slash here to make this the reference string, and then we skip up a string to fill in this voice here. And we do a similar thing here where we set this as the reference string and then skip a string down to fill in this bass note. And then this is the instance where the string memory stuff actually would have an effect on the reference string. So here the reference string is set to this note up here because it has the most recent string position modifier, and then we play these notes coming down. Now when we move on to the next measure here, this string position modifier is based off of the reference string here. It's not based off of these notes. It's based off the most recent string position modifier. And then this is also a string memory example here because we just played it. And then we have another slash to set this middle voice as a reference string. And again, doubled up the slash because it's a line break there. Now this section here is a repeat from before. So it's the same. Moving on. We're going to come all the way down to here, and this is pretty interesting. So what I've done here is, well, we got to look at the music. So the left hand has come up to the treble clef, and it's pretty high up there. So we are starting with this note in the right hand and then walking down right next to it in the left hand. So the easiest way to notate that is to take the reference string from one hand and propagate it downwards to the other hand. So that's what this little notation here means. So you're using this as the reference string for the string position modifiers in the other hand. And you can see in the courtesy string labels that's also shown there. So you're ignoring any previous string positions given before, and we're taking it from the one hand and going down. Then now here, this is the only time in this arrangement that I needed to use a string label. So this isn't a courtesy. This means you actually need to move and play this note on this string. So we're messing around up here in the treble clef, and then we come down and play this low bass note. So there'd be a massive string jump that would just be obnoxious to count. So at that point, it's easier just to reintroduce a string label. And don't be afraid to do this when it's called for. Sometimes it's just the easiest way to get the point across for what you need to be doing. So this is the only time we need to do it in the whole arrangement, though. So that resets. Now this is played on D, and you move going on regularly from there. So this is 5 string skip up from that D string. So now I want to break down the last chord of this arrangement, and this is written in slashed chord notation. So let's take a look at the left hand first. So it looks like a mess, but first off, this slash right here is not Harpejji specific notation at all. This is given to us by, this is just regular piano notation. So the slash here is denoting that the new reference string going forward is the string played on this note here, and then we're moving up a string from the one given here, and that's what we're going to base our slashed notation off of here. So starting, looking back here, and then up a string from the string played on this note, and then that's the string played by this, and we skip a string up, and that plays that, and then from there we skip another string up, and that is where we play that note. Now, similar thing up here. This reference slash is looking back. It's on the line, so it looks all the way back to the G. If it was lower, it would look at this. If it was higher, it would look at this. But since it's right on that line, these are vertically dependent, it goes back and it looks at the G. And then from there, that's where we build our slashed chord off of. So this is the string used on our first note here. Then we go up one string and play this note. And then from that string, we skip the string and come and play this last note. Now this is really important because if we didn't have this second slash here, you wouldn't be basing this off of the G, or not the G, sorry, the E flat here. You would be basing it off of the previous reference string, which is the one up here. So it would completely throw off where the slashed chord is, because the slash here, as it is in slashed chord notation, it is not looking back. It does not look back when it's part of slashed notation. It's going to use the previous reference string, which is given right here. So that's why you need this second slash. It's very important. Now going on, do something similar with the uses of slash to fill in extra voices. So we set this top note as the reference string here, and then skip a string above that to fill in our pinky up here. And then down here, we're skipping 2 strings down from the dominant reference string given in our slashed chord. Because remember, the slashed note is the dominant reference string, so anything moving forward is going to be assumed to be moving from the slashed string position there. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this section. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video now. Thank you so much for watching if you've somehow made it this far. I know it's an info dump of a video, but I really think the Harpejji notation system has the potential to reshape the future of the instrument and really open up a bunch of new possibilities. It gives us a framework to share ideas and develop a real pedagogy for the instrument. So if you do play the Harpejji, please learn how to use this system. It's useless if I'm the only one who uses it, so that's why I put all the work in to make this video, so other people could learn it. So just start simply, like, take a melody that you like, some little figure that you figured out that you like how you play it on the instrument, just write it out on paper. It's pretty easy to handwrite all the symbols and everything. So just start there and then build up to, write out some of your favorite chord voicings and stuff like that, and just build up your knowledge. And, you can try and tackle that Jacob Collier arrangement if you want. But if you do start working on that, don't get discouraged at the beginning, because that is, like, seriously about as hard as it gets. So if you just pull that up and you start trying to play it and it's, like, super frustrating and obnoxious, like, don't just give up on the whole system, because it is really it's not easy. It's basically as hard as it gets. So don't get discouraged if you do try and do that. Just build up simply and expand and get used to patterns and recognizing stuff, and you'll start to see the benefits of being able to abstract out the Harpejji fretboard, into notated music. So also, all of this stuff will be on my blog if you need a refresher in the future, and I'll have the Jacob Collier transcription available to download for free on my website too. I'll make it as easy as I can. And that's about it. So thank you so much for watching. Send this video to anyone you think would like it. Leave a comment. You can reach out to me on my website. I've got a contact me page, and I'll get back to you. So I really want to get feedback from the Harpejji community. There's definitely places to improve this system, and I want buy-in from the established players. I want this to be a system that people use, and it really gets adopted and helps propel the instrument forward. So again, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one. Bye.